Düsseldorf, 1929. A city caught between two worlds. On one side, modernity, electric lights, cinema houses, factories humming with productivity. On the other, the trauma of a war barely ended, a broken economy, a people desperate for normalcy. But normalcy was an illusion. In the heart of this German city, something ancient and primal had awakened, and it wasn't long before the city realized that among its citizens walked a predator, intelligent, patient, and unspeakably cruel. The first body wasn't found immediately. She was a young woman lying in the reeds near the Rhine River, her clothes torn, her skin pale, her throat slashed with almost surgical precision. At first, authorities assumed she was another casualty of poverty, one of many streetwalkers who lived and died in the shadows of the Weimar Republic's collapse. But it didn't end there. Within weeks, another body surfaced, and then another. Women, girls, and even men strangled, stabbed, mutilated. Some had been drained of blood. Others bore bite marks. Rumors began to spread of a killer who drank the blood of his victims. The newspapers coined a name that sent chills through Europe: the Vampire of Düsseldorf. But Peter Kürten wasn't a vampire, he was worse. Behind the name lay a man who walked among the people unnoticed. A husband, a factory worker, a churchgoer. He smiled at his neighbors. He helped old women cross the street. He even returned to the scenes of his crimes to mingle with police officers and watch the aftermath unfold. No one suspected him. That was his genius and his horror. In the evenings, he would slip away, disappearing into the alleys and forests, driven by impulses he described later as a hunger. He stalked with precision, selecting his victims at random, ensuring no pattern could be established. He experimented with methods, with tools, with fear, and with each act he grew bolder, more confident, more perverse. His crimes were not simply murder, they were theater. One night he followed a young girl into the dark and struck her with a hammer. Not to kill her, not yet. He waited until she awoke in agony, looked into his eyes, then crushed her skull as she screamed. Another time, he led a woman into the woods under the pretense of conversation, then slit her throat and waited to hear her dying gasps. Then he went home and had dinner with his wife. The terror gripped Düsseldorf like a plague. Parents locked their doors. Women refused to go out after dusk. The police were overwhelmed. The killer seemed to vanish at will like a ghost. Newspapers fed the hysteria with sensational headlines. The more people feared him, the more power Kürten felt. He was becoming a myth, a monster, a legend. What they didn't know was that Peter Kürten had been killing for decades. Born in 1883, Kürten grew up in a house filled with violence. His father was a sadist, a drunk who raped his own daughter and beat his children mercilessly. Kürten's first known kill came at the age of 9, a classmate drowned in a river under mysterious circumstances. No one suspected the quiet boy with haunted eyes, but something had already broken inside him. As he grew, so did his appetite. He tortured animals. He committed arson. He fantasized about blood, not metaphorically but literally. He described the sensation of stabbing as ecstasy and the sight of flowing blood as arousing. By his 20s, Kürten was already a seasoned predator operating in the shadows of a broken Germany, where war and chaos gave men like him room to thrive. The 1920s should have been a time of hope, but for Düsseldorf, it was a decade of dread. Kürten moved undetected, aided by the very systems meant to protect society. Police departments didn't share information, criminal records were incomplete, and public panic ensured that every new murder sparked more confusion than clarity. In one especially grotesque episode, he stabbed a servant girl in the head with scissors, then sent anonymous letters to the police describing her murder in graphic detail. He didn't sign the letters, he didn't need to. The city already knew him. Or rather, they knew the idea of him, a demon in human form. But Kürten wasn't finished. His crimes escalated not just in frequency, but in audacity. He would return to crime scenes and weep over the graves of his victims. He followed police investigators and offered them misleading tips. He even invited one of his surviving victims to coffee, daring her to remember his face. She didn't. For Kürten, this wasn't simply violence. It was control. A godlike sense of dominance over life and death. The ability to erase someone from the world and walk away unnoticed. The power to terrify an entire population without lifting a finger. But every monster eventually makes a mistake. And in Kürten's case, that mistake would lead to one of the most chilling courtroom confessions in modern history. The Vampire of Düsseldorf was not a myth. He was real, he was charming, and he was just getting started. By early 1930, Düsseldorf was no longer just a city, it was a canvas of fear. Rumors of a blood-drinking killer had spread far beyond Germany's borders, and international media latched onto the most sensational details. Vampire, they called him. Demon. But the truth was more unsettling. The killer wasn't a phantom. He was real. He had a name. And his name was Peter Kürten. And yet for all the fear, no one knew who he was. The streets were patrolled nightly. Officers posed as lovers in parks, hoping to draw the killer into the open. Every man who fit the vague description, a tall figure in a long coat, was interrogated. Hundreds were arrested, questioned, and released. Meanwhile, Kürten watched from the shadows, amused. He even taunted the police in letters mocking their incompetence, describing murders in detail that only the killer could know. But there were no fingerprints, no solid leads. He was invisible. What the police didn't know was that Kürten had returned to normalcy. During the day, he worked like everyone else. A machinist, a husband, a respectable citizen. At night, he transformed like the creature from legend into something primal, something insatiable. And unlike most serial killers, Kürten didn't have a preferred victim. He murdered indiscriminately. Women, children, men, old, young. He chose targets not by type, but by opportunity. That randomness made him untraceable. But it also revealed something deeper. Kürten wasn't killing for lust or revenge. He was killing for sensation. He once told a psychiatrist that hearing the blood gush from a victim's wound gave him the greatest pleasure. He didn't just stab. He listened. He didn't just strangle. He watched the light leave their eyes. And then, as if nothing had happened, he returned home to his wife and made small talk over dinner. His wife Auguste had no idea, or so she claimed. Auguste was not a fool. She had lived through her husband's earlier crimes, petty thefts, assaults, a short prison stint. But she believed he had changed. After all, he was attentive, polite, a quiet man with a curious intensity. She knew he had strange moods, that he walked alone at night, sometimes returned home with his clothes stained. But these were hard times, and people did what they had to. Then came the night that changed everything. It was May 14th, 1930. Kürten had followed a young woman, Maria Budlik, from the train station. She was new to the city, looking for work, frightened alone. Kürten approached her with false kindness, offering to help her find a boarding house. But instead, he led her into the woods. What happened next was both terrifying and extraordinary. Kürten attempted to strangle her, but Maria fought back. She screamed, she scratched, and by some miracle she got away. She went to the police the next day, trembling and bruised, and gave a description of her attacker. At first, it was just another incident, one of dozens. But then Maria remembered something. She had visited Kürten's apartment after the attack, briefly under his manipulation. She remembered the building, the door, the floor. The police followed the trail. They knocked, and Peter Kürten answered. What happened next shocked the entire world. He didn't flee. He didn't deny. In fact, he asked to be taken quietly. As they led him away, he was calm, serene, almost relieved. At the station, Kürten confessed to everything. Every murder, every assault, every anonymous letter. He described the feel of his knife, the screams of his victims, the way he returned to their graves to relive the moment. He spoke not with shame, but with fascination. It was as though he had waited years for someone to listen. In the days that followed, his story unfolded like a horror novel. He claimed responsibility for over 60 crimes. He mapped out body locations. He led police to the burial sites. His precision was unnerving. One officer described it as like watching a surgeon dissect the soul of the city. Psychiatrists were brought in. Was he mad? Was he a monster? Or simply evil? The answer chillingly was none of the above. Kürten was sane, fully aware, fully conscious. He knew right from wrong, he just didn't care. To him, murder was like music. Each killer note in a symphony only he could hear. The more people feared him, the more powerful he felt. He once said, "I existed in a world where I could play God." But even gods fall. At his trial, Kürten sat calmly as prosecutors described the atrocities. He listened to testimonies from survivors, from families of the dead, and when it was his turn to speak, he didn't deny. Instead, he explained, in detail, with eerie detachment. Some jurors cried, others stared in disbelief. No one could comprehend how such depravity could reside within such an ordinary man. The court sentenced him to death. But before he was executed, Kürten made one final horrifying request. He asked the prison doctor if he would be able to hear the sound of his own blood spurting from his neck after the guillotine fell. That was the last question Peter Kürten ever asked. On July 2nd, 1931, the Vampire of Düsseldorf was beheaded by guillotine. But his story did not die. His head was preserved in formaldehyde and later put on display. Psychologists studied it. Journalists photographed it. Tourists gawked at it in American museums. It became a symbol of fear, of fascination, of the thin line between humanity and horror. And for nearly a century, that head severed from its body continued to whisper from behind the glass, a reminder that monsters don't live in shadows. They walk beside us unnoticed. When the guillotine's blade fell on Peter Kürten in 1931, the immediate reaction was a collective sigh of relief. The city of Düsseldorf, which had lived under the shadow of unspeakable terror, could finally breathe. But as it turns out, monsters like Kürten do not die in silence. They echo. Within weeks of his execution, something strange began to happen. Police departments across Europe and the United States began revisiting old case files, unsolved murders, disappearances, assaults that had long been shelved as cold cases. Kürten's confessions had been so vivid, so detailed, that many began to wonder if there were others like him, copycats, or perhaps silent predators emboldened by the chaos he had inspired. In the media, Kürten had become more than a criminal. He had become a myth. Newspapers ran headlines calling him the German Dracula, the king of vampires, and the man who drank death. His crimes were retold with lurid detail. Book publishers, filmmakers, and pulp fiction writers saw a grotesque opportunity, and they took it. The cultural fascination with Kürten's legacy was immediate, and it was profitable. In America, tabloids sold stories of European vampire killers with exaggerated accounts of blood-drinking rituals. In Germany, theatre productions were staged based on his life-blending horror with surrealism. His preserved head, shipped to the United States and housed in the Ripley's Believe It or Not museum, became an attraction in and of itself. Families posed for photos with the killer's skull floating in formaldehyde, smiling unaware, or perhaps ignoring the weight of the horror behind the glass. But while the public consumed Kürten's story like horror entertainment, criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement officers viewed it differently. They saw him as a case study. Kürten became a pivotal figure in the nascent field of criminal profiling. Forensic psychiatry was still in its infancy, but Kürten's interviews with Dr. Karl Berg, a pioneering German psychiatrist, provided rare insight into the mind of a seemingly sane serial killer. Berg's written account titled The Sadist became one of the earliest psychological profiles of a modern serial killer. In it, Kürten's motivations were laid bare. Not insanity, not ideology, but pleasure. Sensory gratification through violence. Blood as erotic currency. This psychological profile would later be cited in numerous investigations: the Boston Strangler, the Zodiac Killer son of Sam. Kürten's legacy helped lay the groundwork for what the FBI would eventually codify into their behavioral science unit in the 1970s. Ironically, the monster who had terrified Düsseldorf became one of the reasons future monsters could be understood, or at least tracked. But not everyone saw it as progress. Survivors of Kürten's crimes, or families of the murdered, viewed the fascination with his legacy as a second violation. Their pain, their loss, had become commodified, turned into spectacle, into museum displays, into books and screenplays and academic papers, and that pain resurfaced in the decades to come. Every few years, someone would rediscover Peter Kürten's story, a new documentary, a new Netflix pitch, a new psychological deep dive podcast. And every time the old photographs would resurface, the head in the jar, the crime scene illustrations, the haunting eyes that once stalked the alleys of Düsseldorf. Every time the headlines would remind the world of the vampire who lived among us. But Peter Kürten wasn't just a ghost. His life told a deeper story, one about the systems that failed to stop him, about a city that ignored warning signs, about a society that romanticizes evil even as it condemns it. For example, long before his murder spree, Kürten had shown violent tendencies. He had tortured animals as a child. He had sexually assaulted young girls in his youth. He had been incarcerated multiple times. But each time he slipped through the cracks, insufficient psychological evaluation, lack of coordination between police forces, and an unwillingness to confront what true evil might look like. This wasn't just the story of one man, it was the story of a culture unprepared for horror that wore a human face. And as time went on, that face became more familiar. In the 1960s, the crimes of Ed Gein shocked rural Wisconsin. In the 1970s, Ted Bundy smiled for cameras while recounting the deaths of young women. In the 1990s, Jeffrey Dahmer described dismembering his victims and preserving their parts in his freezer. Each of them in some way echoed Kürten's blueprint: charm masking sadism, normalcy masking horror. Kürten's ghost had spread. And so had the questions. What makes a person do such things? Is it nature or nurture? Evil or illness? Are monsters born, or are they created? These were not idle thoughts, they were studied, debated, analyzed. And always Kürten was there in the footnotes. A case too perfect to ignore, a legacy too grotesque to forget. But as much as scholars debated him, the public remained drawn to his story for one simple reason: fear. Not the fear of being attacked, but the fear of not knowing, of living beside someone, working beside someone, even loving someone, who could one day become something else. That fear perhaps is what kept Kürten's legend alive longer than any of his crimes. And it is what brought his severed head, still suspended in formaldehyde, to an air-conditioned glass case in a museum half a world away, where children point tourists gawk and the whispers of the Vampire of Düsseldorf live on. In 2001, at a Ripley's Believe It or Not museum in Wisconsin Dells, tourists gathered around a glass box. Inside floated a human head, nearly perfectly preserved in a cloudy yellowish fluid. A small plaque beneath it read, "Peter Kürten, the Vampire of Düsseldorf." It wasn't just a curiosity, it was an artifact, a relic of a monstrous past suspended in formaldehyde, daring the world to forget what it represented. Nearly 70 years had passed since his execution, yet Peter Kürten's name refused to fade into obscurity. His crimes had long left the realm of court records and entered cultural mythology films, novels, documentaries, even music and university criminology courses. What kept him alive in the collective memory was not just the brutality of his acts, but the chilling duality he embodied. A man who looked normal, behaved kindly, yet harbored unfathomable evil beneath the surface. To the public, Kürten was one of the most horrific serial killers of the 20th century. But to sociologists and historians, he was something more: a symbol, a reflection of a society unraveling. Post-World War I, Germany was plagued with poverty, chaos, and disillusionment. It was in this fractured world that Kürten found a hiding place for his demons among neighbors, too distracted by survival to notice the predator next door. And as Kürten emerged from that darkness, so too would others: Andrei Chikatilo in Soviet Russia, John Wayne Gacy in America, monsters thriving in the cracks of broken systems. Their stories all echoed one theme: where law and community fail, evil finds its sanctuary. But Peter Kürten stood apart. Because he knew what he was. He understood his infamy. In the final hours before his execution, he asked the prison doctor a question that still sends chills through history. Will I be able to hear the blood gushing from my neck when my head is severed? That would be the ultimate pleasure, the final thrill. This was not insanity. This was a man completely aware of the spectacle he was creating. He knew his legacy would not be his victims, but the nightmares he left behind. And those nightmares have endured. In Japan, an avant-garde opera company staged a production inspired by Kürten's murders. In Germany, an industrial metal band released an album titled Blutdurst Bloodthirst, featuring Kürten's eyes on the cover. In the United States, notorious serial killer Richard Ramirez once confessed during an interrogation, "I see myself as the Vampire of Düsseldorf." Investigators were horrified, and every time a new killer is caught, the media inevitably asks, is this another Peter Kürten? His spectre still looms, but perhaps the most disturbing legacy isn't Kürten himself. It's how society continues to embrace figures like him under the guise of curiosity. We transform horror into entertainment, atrocity into iconography. Beneath the veil of fascination, we allow these monsters to live on not as warnings but as commodities. His image is printed on t-shirts, tattooed on bodies sold in souvenir shops. His words are quoted in songs, splashed across dark literature shared online. He has become a symbol of a culture that not only remembers violence, but sometimes worships it. That's not just obsession, that's a loss of moral gravity. In the end, the question is no longer why Peter Kürten did what he did. The real question is, why do we continue to let him live? Not in flesh, not in blood, but in the unwavering gaze at his preserved head floating in a jar, as if it holds some divine truth. He does not deserve that, but we, those who keep retelling his story, must ask ourselves, what is the purpose? If not to learn, if not to warn, then what are we doing by keeping Kürten alive? Perhaps by telling his story truthfully, without glamour, without myth, we aim to do the opposite, bury the monster once and for all, because some shadows must be illuminated not to glorify them, but so they never return.